This risk and crisis communication case study will focus on the public relations disaster that occurred after April 2017 to United Airlines in the United States. In order to properly deconstruct and deliver this case study, I'm going to give a full recount of the events that took place and the communications that followed. Then we will analyse the theory behind the crisis and break it down through stakeholders, accounts and postures, relationships between company and client, and how the crisis reflected the issue's life cycle. We begin this case study on April 9, 2017, on United Express's flight 3411. The plane was set to depart O'Hare International Airport in Chicago for Louisville. However, a violent altercation erupted when it was announced that extra room was required for several flight crew who were in need of seats on the flight for work purposes. As with many airlines in the US, a policy existed where an airline reserves the right to bump passengers if a flight is overbooked and the seats are needed for crew members and staff. Passengers are ordinarily asked to give up their seats voluntarily in exchange for flight vouchers, which they can then use to help pay for a replacement flight. On the flight in question, 4 passengers were asked to give up their seat. 3 did so voluntarily, but one passenger, 69-year-old Dr. David Deo, refused to give up his seat because he claimed the flight was his last chance to reach the hospital he worked at Louisville before the beginning of his shift the next day. Dr. Deo was eventually removed rather forcibly from his seat. There was a brief struggle, and the result was the doctor being dragged by United Airlines security down the aisle and off the plane. Deo was left bloodied, having reportedly lost several teeth as well as suffering a broken rib and nose. Onlookers in their seats watched horrified as the events unfolded. Now, the answer to the question, how do we have all this information, is because the entire incident was actually captured by a passenger on their camera phone. The video was posted online, where it quickly went viral as the public viewed what seemed to be an innocent plane passenger being assaulted by security. The images were indeed confronting. With little context behind the images, the video simply showed an elderly Asian man being roughed up by 2 burly security guards and lying motionless and bleeding as a result. Naturally, this caused an initial public outcry as media outlets across the US and through social media picked up the footage and relayed the violent images to their audience. United Airlines and their heavy-handed tactics were officially on the public agenda. Shortly after the video was made public, United Airlines CEO Oscar Munoz responded by justifying the actions of United Airlines security due to the behaviour of Deo, and released a short public statement which included the following. "This is an upsetting event to all of us here at United. I apologise for having to reaccommodate these customers. Our team is moving with a sense of urgency to work with the authorities and conduct our own detailed review of what happened. We are also reaching out to this passenger to talk directly to him and further address and resolve this situation." After issuing his statement, the CEO also sent out communications to United Airlines staff, which included the following. "Like you, I was upset to hear about what happened last night aboard United Express flight 3411 headed from Chicago to Louisville. While the facts and circumstances are still evolving, especially with respect to why this customer defied Chicago aviation security officers the way he did, to give you a clearer picture of what transpired, I've included below a recap of the preliminary reports filed by our employees. As you will read, this situation was unfortunately compounded when one of the passengers we politely asked to deplane refused, and it became necessary to contact Chicago aviation security officers to help. Our employees followed established procedures for dealing with situations like this. While I deeply regret this situation arose, I also emphatically stand behind all of you, and I want to commend you for continuing to go above and beyond to ensure we fly right." The letter to staff also included a recap of the events on the airplane, in which Munoz described Dr. Deo as having been disruptive and belligerent. Unfortunately for United Airlines and CEO Munoz, this letter to staff also went public. Due to the ongoing media coverage, the public were served a combination of the violent footage along with a series of official corporate statements which seemed to shift blame onto the passenger and victim, and support and even commend the actions that were captured. The public were also furious that a combination of airline jargon and public relations spin was part of their first response. According to media sources around the US at the time, United Airlines customers had started to hint that a boycott was on the horizon, as they were fueled by the anger over what had they considered to be a complete mishandling and lack of empathy over the situation. The US Senate had also called for an inquiry in order to obtain a proper and detailed account of what happened. Following this new wave of backlash, Munoz released another statement and approached the media, this time with a full and sincere apology. Part of his final apology statement read, "I want you to know that we take full responsibility and we will work to make it right. It is never too late to do the right thing. I have committed to our customers and our employees that we are going to fix what's broken so this never happens again. This will include a thorough review of crew movement, our policies for incentivizing volunteers in these situations, how we can handle oversold situations, and an examination of how we partner with airport authorities and local law enforcement. I promise you we will do better." The conclusion of this incident involving United Express Flight 3411 included a legal battle in which Dr. Deo received an undisclosed settlement, a commitment by United Airlines to review and actively amend their passenger policies, and a sorely damaged reputation, which is still discussed by PR professionals to this day as one of the worst PR mishaps to occur in recent years. So now that we've taken a detailed look at what happened, we can bring further analysis to this case study. I'm going to start with the crisis stakeholders. First and foremost, and quite obviously, the primary stakeholders include the airline and its passengers on Flight 3411, especially Dr. Deo, who is at the centre of the incident. We can also include company investors and, of course, CEO Oscar Munoz as a key stakeholder, due to the effect this had on his reputation. We also include 2 security guards who assaulted Dr. Deo, who were reportedly fired after a settlement had been reached. However, what makes this incident such a significant PR case study is the potential scope of stakeholders. At the time of the incident, when such actions by security were supported and deemed within the boundary of company policy, the stakeholder list also essentially includes any potential human being on a United Airlines flight. And while this type of incident would be considered high impact but extremely rare, it did support the implication that if you, a random United Airlines passenger, happened to disagree with their policies, you could very well be at risk of similar violent treatment. Everyone who viewed the footage of Dr. Deo would have asked themselves, could this then happen to me? When taking a look at crisis communication postures, we can see that United Airlines took several in order to match its response strategies to the situation. In their first communication, their posture was easily identified as the denial strategy. Munoz sought to remove any connection between the crisis and the organisation by placing blame squarely on Dr. Deo for being disagreeable. He also denied by claiming the whole incident was justifiable by the airline's policies. However, when this strategy backfired, Munoz changed postures to a bolstering strategy, which included taking full responsibility and committing to change and compensation. Bolstering was adopted in hopes to undo the damage his initial approach had caused, attempting to build a positive connection between the organisation and the stakeholders. An element which contributed to the intensity and intrigue of this case study was the level of risk outrage the incident generated. After the footage was released to the public, it was made clear that there was an inherent risk in flying with United Airlines. That risk being that if you refused to give up your seat, you could end up with a bloodied face. Now, this sentiment we previously touched on in stakeholders, when discussing stakeholders, and how such a perceived risk could turn any individual who is asked to deplane a crisis stakeholder. The level of seriousness for a PR crisis is determined by the presumed risk of the crisis. Risk, according to the model by Peter Sandman, is measured by integrating hazard and outrage. In other words, we take the technical assessment of a risk and then combine the outrage, or cultural perception of seriousness, to determine the level of the crisis. No matter how serious the risk is in hazard terms, Sandman's approach to risk measurement maintains that the degree of outrage is likely to determine much of the public's response to the risk. In other words, the United Airlines incident upped in intensity after the CEO made his statement supporting the actions of security, which solidified people's perception that not only could this potentially happen to them, but it was company policy to actively inflict the same damage onto other passengers. An interesting point to this case study is how it interacts with the four-stage cycle of a crisis. Now, in this context, I am referring to Stephen Fink's work in crisis management, in which he borrowed from medical terminology to describe a crisis as a kind of chronic disease or affliction that develops over time. Fink's four-stage cycle includes prodromal, acute, chronic, and resolution stages. In a nutshell, the prodromal stage is equivalent to the pre-crisis. The acute stage is the point of no return, where the crisis has erupted. The chronic stage is equivalent to the cleanup phase or recovery from the crisis. And finally, the resolution stage implies some level of success in managing the crisis. What makes this crisis so significant is how it becomes a double crisis. The security footage sparked the first crisis and the first acute phase, and Munoz attempted to reach the chronic phase with a communication strategy that supported employees instead of passengers. As a result, rather than reach a resolution, Munoz and United Airlines fell back into a second acute phase and a new crisis brought about by the public reaction to Munoz's original efforts. It became evidence that if crisis communication is not handled properly, you can find yourself trapped in a perpetual state of crisis with no resolution in sight. Since this incident occurred in 2017 and took the media world by storm, there have understandably been many opinions and insights shared by commentators, PR professionals, and experts in the field of crisis communication. After analysing this case study, I'm going to go now and share my own. First of all, a devil's advocate could say that Munoz chose to show support for his people first, rather than condemning the incident and admitting guilt, throwing his staff and company under the proverbial bus. However, due to the need for action in direct response to the footage, which had an effect on the public, it would have been highly recommended that the series of statements be delivered in reverse. The CEO should have addressed the public first, with a genuine admission of guilt, a commitment to review the airline's policies and to take action against those involved, and a statement of reassurance to customers that something like this would never happen again. PR spin and jargon should have been completely left out of the issue, and more conversational tone should have been adopted. Essentially, the sentiment Munoz delivered at the end, that United Airlines got it completely wrong, should have been expressed much earlier. He could then have gone on to address the company in a way that strongly discourages the actions taken, but that he also supports staff who work to maintain the airline's values. Now, I would have also recommended to remain out of the camera's eye right until the very end, opting to communicate primarily through statements and media releases, which would have allowed for his actions to prove his words rather than giving people a face to jeer. That concludes this crisis communications case study. Thank you for your attention.